So I want to muse today a little bit on the nature of ego, which is a word used in many different ways. It comes from originally the psychoanalytic context, where Freud talked about it as a kind of function of the mind, and is sort of used in spiritual contexts in the 20th century, um, as a kind of translation for certain words in the Hindu and Buddhist lexicon, where it might not have been entirely appropriate. You know, they're basically kind of like two senses in which it's used and sort of confused in current spiritual notions. One is an essentially kind of psychological version of it, where ego refers to things that relate to protecting one's self image and the whole host of notions that are connected with that. And the other is the ego as the sense of identification with the personal identity. Uh, well, at the deepest level, simply the notion that I'm a separate, experiencing, doing entity, a body mind complex, right? And even there, one could divide because there could be the ego as the instrument, as the instrumental function of the I. What do I mean by that? I mean that which enables the sense of waking consciousness, whatever that sense is. I say it as if it's nothing to say that, but of course, these are all debatable. And then there's identification with that, which might be separate, or it might not be, depending on how you want to look at things, because these things immediately become twisted and intricate as soon as you try to examine them. I want to give you a couple of interesting stories, to sort of illustrate the thorny thickets of complexities in these areas. And there are links between these different ideas of ego, but let's explore through a little storytelling. So, one story I want to tell is from this guy Sakita. He wrote a book called Zen Training, and in it he relates an anecdote about one of the great Zen masters who had such a pure, still, quiet mind that it was said that he was invisible. Uh, because effectively, he didn't exist. The I didn't exist. It couldn't be seen. This is it's a kind of metaphor, right? If are you there? Are you there? If the mind is so pure, if the mind is so still, it's a good question. It's an extension of the same old Zen chestnut about if a tree falls in the forest and no one is there to hear it, does it make a sound? Well, if the mind is utterly pure and the attention is turned inward, is the mind there to be seen? Anyhow, his mind was pure. He was said to be invisible. And one of the gods really wanted to see him. So this god came up with a clever scheme. He disarranged things slightly in the monastery's backyard. Like made things a bit disorganized. And this guy, when he came out and saw it, for a moment, he was irritated. Just for a second. He was a little bit irritated by the state of this backyard. And in that moment, it was said he became visible. And, of course, the god then saw him. And then he went back to being invisible. So one could say that for a second, in one use of the term, that the ego was activated there. And you have other stories, many stories in Hindu mythology of enlightened sages subject to various kinds of emotional eruptions of various kinds, you know, both the great sages Agastya and Vashishta were said to have at various points attempted to kill themselves out of suicidal depression. The sage Yagnavalkya was afflicted by greed and demanded this much gold, essentially, for expounding the nature of Brahman, some 10,000 cows worth of gold or something like that. I can't remember the exact amount. It was from the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad. Durvasa was said to be very quick to anger, and had a lot of pride that was connected to that. Uh, Vishwamitra also, various kinds of pride connected to his doings. You know, he would go and meditate for some 10,000 years, and then he would get pricked by someone basically saying, "Well, if you're such a great sage, can't you do this for me, or can't you do that for me?" And he would go off and do it, and he would lose his concentration in that. So there are these different kinds of ideas of uh, this kind of ego operation, which is rooted in the self-image and has certain kinds of emotions connected to it, right? So at one level, um, you could say this is ego. What kinds of emotions? I mean, we could clarify further, right? Because it's not exactly usually that something like, let's say, hunger or thirst is considered an egoic desire. I mean, they're desires, and in some sense, they're connected to the notion of being a body. Because if you weren't a body, why would you seek to satisfy your hunger? But they aren't considered problematic in the same way because they don't involve essentially certain kinds of fantasies of being um, this kind of entity in time that is attempting to help itself, that is attempting to expand itself out of a belief that it can grow into happiness, essentially, that happiness is some sort of thing that if it fulfilled enough of its desires, it could sort of expand into it, you know. In Hinduism, there are three canonical problematic desires, you know: greed, lust, anger. These are three egoic indications because they're coming from that particular kind of self-image, right? Greed, I want more because I am a person with a past and a future who wants things to aggrandize that image, right? Lust. This isn't merely referring to sexual activity. This is referring to the desire to dominate, possess, and control another person, right? And the desire, again, to sort of gain pleasure because it's the symbolic meaning of that that's the issue, right? And to be lost in the fantasies of what could be and what might have been, you know? And anger, again, what is anger connected to? Anger is connected to how dare you, essentially, something like that, right? A kind of set of shoulds that are all oriented and connected to this self-image. The violation of those shoulds causes resentment and thus anger. So it's very interesting and tricky, right? Because you have these kinds of structures around the self-image that are connected to, and you have it, for example, in the Yoga Sutras, you have the idea of vrittis. Vrittis aren't just any thought. Vrittis are like imaginative thoughts, fantasies of obtaining things, fantasies of revenging things, right? Fantasies and regrets, past and future, all these things are sort of connected, right? This living in this sort of fantastical past and future. Those could be said to be egoic in some sense. But even those aren't necessarily problematic, because the deeper issue is, does one identify with those? So what does that mean? What that means is this, right? The reason that those particular kinds of egoic manifestations are deemed problematic for the seeker is that they tend to be impediments to quieting the mind. And quieting the mind is what allows one to look inward, and looking inward is what allows the destruction of ignorance. And ignorance is what causes identification with all of these issues, right? Identification with, meaning that you believe that you are them. That's the real problem, right? The real problem isn't the thing itself. The real problem is identification with the thing, whatever that is. Identification with the thing isn't really a thing itself. Identification is itself an illusion, right? But to see that, to recognize that, one has to quiet the mind. And to quiet the mind, one has to stop the many, many, many branching, movements of egoic desire, and bring the attention inward, quiet the mind, concentrate the attention, and move it inward. If it has been recognized that identification is an illusion, and that the self is all there is, then it actually doesn't matter what these so-called egoic manifestations are or aren't. The self is all there is. One doesn't identify with these egoic issues. And if one doesn't identify with the egoic issues, can they be said to exist? Right? So the egoic manifestations at one level are connected to fantasies, regrets, and emotions that center around a kind of imaginary self-image. And spread out desire and ramify desire when you follow them. Bring that stuff in, concentrate inward, but then you become free of the sense of identification with those issues. Now what that does is, it has all these multiple contradictory and difficult to describe effects, right? Because at one level, there's no one observing any of these things to begin with. And if no one is observing any of these things, again, do they actually exist? Who's saying that these things exist? Who's saying that actions are taken? Who's saying that emotions are happening? Who's saying that memories occur? Who's saying that imaginative things are occurring? Who's saying that fantasies are happening? But by the same token, funnily enough, if one wants to speak in that language, those things are quieted. Those things are quieted on the path to being a seeker, and those things are further quieted, quote unquote, once a quote unquote recognition has happened. Because the mind further, if it can be said to exist at all, moves away because it doesn't find satisfaction in those things. and yet they could be said to occur, right? And you have this other set of issues, right, which is what's happening from the outside may not be what's happening on the inside. The sage could be acting in a greedy manner, but that doesn't necessarily mean that that's what they're feeling. And even if it is what they're feeling, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's what they're really feeling, because what is so-called felt may not be identified with. And then there's the further complication that, in fact, there is no such thing as identification at all, right? None of us are, in fact, really feeling greed, anger, or lust. These things are merely said for the seeker, a seeker which itself doesn't, in the end analysis, really exist. What a thicket. And then there's a further issue where in the traditional teachings, one is taught to discipline oneself and, you know, deliberately using willpower and knowledge, move away from one's desires, from one's egoic desires. Whereas the path that I prefer is the honest admission of one's desires, right? The exclusion, right? The pretending that, oh, I don't want this. I'm telling myself I don't want this, right? When in fact you do want this. That's far more problematic, because then you are caught up in a rigidity uh, where you can't actually learn, you can't actually move, you can't actually flow, you can't actually change, because you're denying your emotional reality. And unfortunately, a lot of these kinds of denials happen outside of our awareness and can't even be corrected, because we're not sufficiently aware of them to correct them, right? That's why, I often emphasize the power of psychoanalytic psychotherapy, which is not all therapy, it's a certain kind of therapy, because it focuses on the power of the unconscious. But these are some of the complications of the concept of the ego in spiritual practice, and I want to kind of share my musings with you on this. Uh, Ultimately, there is a kind of inevitable confusion surrounding the term, because it always touches on this issue of identification, right? And identification is an illusory concept. So when we're circling around this concept of identification, um, which is a concept that itself in the end analysis doesn't make any sense because it doesn't exist, or it's a kind of on the border of existence and non-existence, you can't make perfect sense of all that surrounds it. And the foundation is flickering in between reality and unreality, so to say. You can't build a structure that is going to be a perfect analysis of what's going on.